Welcome to my reading of the original story, The Hollow Folk. First, I'd like to say thank you for joining me. Then I would like to let you know that this is a tale of existential dread, fear, and horror. It is not meant for children, and should only be listened to by those who wish to have themselves tested with a tale that makes them think and makes them sweat a little. This is a tale of broken promises and promises kept. It's a tale from the American Irish in celebration of St. Patrick's Day. It takes place in the place where many of them settled, Appalachia, and specifically during the late 19th and early 20th century. This story takes place specifically in West Virginia, 1923. And I will begin with the first chapter, Whispers in the Hollow. Jacob Bellamy had been playing by the tree line no more than a stone's throw from his family's cabin when his mother turned her back for a moment. Just one moment, long enough to pull the biscuits from the oven, wipe her hands on her apron, and call for him to come inside. But when she stepped onto the porch, the yard was empty. She searched first with a mother's patience, then with a mother's rising dread. His name echoed through the hollow, bouncing off the trees swallowed by the mountains. By nightfall, the men were combing the woods with lanterns and rifles. By dawn, they had found only his footprints, leading to the tree line, then stopping. Jacob Bellamy had walked towards the forest, and then vanished into nothing. The morning after the search party returned empty-handed, Eileen O'Shea heard her father curse under his breath at the breakfast table. "Damn fool ought to know better." Eileen glanced up from her plate of eggs, startled. Her father, Seamus O'Shea, wasn't the type to show emotion, especially not over town gossip. "She's lost her child," Eileen said cautiously. "You can't blame her for being upset." Seamus gave her a sharp look. "Ain't blaming her for mourning, but I'm blaming her for speaking of it." Her father's fingers curled around his coffee mug. He looked older than usual this morning, his face drawn, his eyes heavy-lidded with a weight he hadn't spoken aloud. Eileen swallowed a bite of toast. "What's that supposed to mean?" Seamus exhaled through his nose. He set the mug down. "Oh, never you mind." "Pa, I said never you mind." The sharpness in his voice cut the air between them. Eileen shut her mouth. It wasn't the first time her father had spoken in half-answers, muttering about things best left alone. But something about the way he was gripping that coffee mug, his knuckles white, the tendons tight, made a cold feeling settle in her gut. Across the table, her father's eyes flicked towards the window, the trees swaying in the early moonlight. In the early morning light. Eileen had the distinct sense that he wasn't watching them. He was listening. For what, she couldn't say, but the hairs on her arms stood on end all the same. That afternoon, Eileen stopped by Clara Bellamy's house. She hadn't known Jacob well, only in the way that everyone knew everyone in a small town as theirs. But Clara was her closest friend, and Eileen wanted to offer what comfort she could. She found Clara sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders, staring numbly at the yard. The Bellamy cabin was small, but well kept, and nestled against the trees at the edge of town. Eileen hesitated before stepping onto the wooden planks. Clara didn't look at her. "He was just there," Clara murmured. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't slept all night. Eileen followed her gaze toward the trees. The autumn wind made leaves rustle, the branches sway, and a few crows hopped between the roots, pecking at the ground. "I know," Eileen said softly. Clara swallowed hard. Mama says she heard something." Eileen frowned. "Heard what?" Clara's fingers dug into the wool of the blanket. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She said she heard laughter." Eileen felt something in her stomach twist. Clara turned her head for the first time. Eileen saw the fear in her friend's eyes. "She says it wasn't Jacob's." The wind picked up. A whispering sound rustled through the trees, and for a moment, a single, fleeting moment, Eileen could have sworn she heard it too. Laughter. Thin, distant, almost human, but not quite. Not quite. That night, the town gathered at the church, not for a sermon, but for something older, something deeper. A meeting had been called, as was tradition when a child went missing. No one called it a wake because no one dared say the word dead. Not yet. Eileen sat beside her father in the wood pews. The smell of candle wax and damp wool thickened the air. The town's elders sat at the front, their faces drawn, their hands clasped at their laps. Clara Bellamy's mother, Margaret, stood to speak. Her voice was raw, her eyes rimmed red. My Jacob did not wander, she spoke slowly, deliberately. He did not fall. Murmurs stirred through the church. I heard him laughing, Margaret continued. But it wasn't him. It was something else. The murmurs died. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides. Sheriff Eli Turner cleared his throat. He was a broad-shouldered man, built like an ox. His hat clutched tightly in his hands. Now, Miss Bellamy. Margaret turned to face him. You don't believe me, she said flatly. None of you do. A heavy silence followed. Eileen glanced at the elders in the front row. Most of them avoided Margaret's gaze. But old Widow Callahan, one of the last of the Irish settlers, a woman older than anyone could remember, was staring at her intently. After a long pause, the widow spoke. They are watching. A hush fell over the room, and Sheriff Turner sighed. Not this again. They are watching, Widow Callahan repeated, her voice low and firm. Same as they always have. She turned her gaze towards Margaret. You heard them in the trees. Margaret hesitated, then nodded. And you spoke of it. Margaret's face twisted. What was I supposed to do? Stay silent? Yes, Callahan said simply. Eileen felt a chill crawl up her spine. Seamus shifted beside her, his jaw tight, his fingers curling against his knee. He hadn't said a word since they arrived. Callahan's wrinkled hands gripped the edges of her shawl. There's rules, child, same as there's always been. Margaret's voice shook. What rules? The ones our ancestors brought with them, Callahan said. The ones they left behind in Ireland thinking they could outrun them. A cold weight settled in Eileen's stomach. Callahan's voice was steady, but her eyes burned with something fierce. They came with us, and they do not forget. Margaret let out a bitter, broken laugh. You mean tell me, she swept her arms wide, looking around the room, her voice rising, that my boy is gone because some old wives' tale, because I spoke some name. Callahan didn't flinch. You acknowledge them. Margaret let out a choking sob, shaking her head. No. The church remained silent, because deep down, everyone knew the stories. Don't call them. Don't speak of them. Don't wander past the tree line after dark. Because they were watching. They were always watching. Eileen's father stood abruptly. Enough of this. The crowd turned towards him. Seamus's voice was low, controlled. But Eileen could hear the anger barely contained beneath it. We all know the search is what matters now, not superstitions. Sheriff Turner nodded. Finally, a man of some sense. Callahan didn't argue. She simply looked at Seamus, long and knowing, before she turned her gaze towards Eileen. And for a brief second, the old woman's lips parted, like she was about to say something. But then she didn't. Instead, she just exhaled softly, shaking her head. Eileen wasn't sure why, but the gesture made her stomach twist. Margaret Bellamy was still crying. The elders sat stiffly in their seats. Sheriff Turner pinched the bridge of his nose, looking exhausted. And as Seamus turned to leave, he muttered to Eileen under his breath, We're going home. The walk back to their cabin was silent. The air was crisp, the sky above them deep and black, the stars sharp as needles. Eileen stole a glance at her father. Her father's face was hard set, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. She hesitated before speaking. You knew what Callahan was talking about. Seamus didn't respond. Aileen's stomach tightened. Didn't you? Her father sighed through his nose. Aileen, you never tell me anything. I tell you what you need to know. And that's not the same thing, Pa. Silence. Seamus's boots crunched over the frost-covered leaves. Finally he muttered. You'd be wise to listen to her, though. Eileen blinked. What? Her father kept walking. Old superstitions stick around for a reason. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. Pa, I thought you didn't believe in all that. I don't, he said flatly, but I also don't test it. Eileen frowned. That's not exactly comforting. Seamus stopped in front of their cabin, his hand on the knob. He finally looked at her, really looked at her. And what she saw in his eyes made her breath hitch. Not fear, not anger, just something heavy. You don't have to believe in something for it to be real, Eileen, he said quietly. Then he pushed open the door, stepping inside. Eileen stood there for a moment, the wind picking up behind her, making the trees rustle. She glanced back at the woods. Something about them felt different, darker. Maybe it was just her imagination. With a shiver, she stepped inside after her father, shutting the door behind her. Outside, in the far-off distance, the wind howled, but beneath it, so faint, could almost be mistaken for a trick of the mind. Something laughed. That night was colder than it should have been. Eileen lay in bed, curled beneath the patchwork quilt her mother had made years ago. The cabin was quiet, save for the occasional pop from the dying fire in the hearth. But she couldn't sleep. Her father's words stuck to the inside of her skull like wet leaves. You don't have to believe in something for it to be real. Eileen rolled onto her side, glaring at the wall. Superstition. That's all it was. Jacob Bellamy had gone missing. Now people were turning to old stories to explain it because it was easier than facing the truth. Something or someone took him. A wild animal, hidden sinkhole, kidnapper passing through on an old mountain road. Not laughter in the trees, not some hollow folk. She sighed, rubbing her eyes. Her father had barely spoken another word after they got home. He sat by the fire nursing a glass of whiskey, shoulders hunched forward like a man carrying a weight he refused to acknowledge. It wasn't just grief for Jacob. It wasn't even guilt. It was something else. Something he wasn't telling her. The wind rattled the window pane. Eileen exhaled, rolling onto her back. Sleep would come eventually. It had to. Her eyes fluttered shut, and then a whisper. Eileen caught her breath. She sat up, heart hammering. The room was dark, shadows stretching across the wooden floor. Had she imagined it? She strained her ears, the silence pressing in around her. Nothing. Slowly she eased back down. It's just nerves, she told herself. Just a long day. The town had been tense. Her father had been tense. And it was making her hear things that weren't. Eileen. A shiver ran up her spine. This time she was sure it wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. It was her name, whispered from outside. She turned her head towards the window. The frost-edged glass reflected the dim glow of the embers in the hearth. Beyond that, just darkness. The trees swayed gently, their black silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Someone was out there. Someone was saying her name. Her fingers curled into the quilt. 100 possible explanations ran through her mind. Maybe it was Clara. Maybe she had come looking for her, needing company, No. The voice hadn't been Clara's. It hadn't been anyone's. Not really. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. Don't call back. The thought came unbidden, sliding into her mind like an instinct, like something she had always known but never had a reason to remember. Don't answer. Don't acknowledge it. She licked her lips suddenly dry. She sat there, rigid, staring at the window, listening, waiting. But the whisper didn't come again. After what felt like forever, she forced herself to lay back down, pulling the covers up to her chin, her pulse refusing to slow. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the silence, trying to shout out the feeling that something had just reached out to her from beyond the glass, and was still there, still watching, waiting. She did not sleep. Morning came sluggish and gray. Eileen had barely slept a wink. Every time she closed her eyes, she swore she could still hear the whisper, her name drifting on the wind like a loose thread waiting to be pulled. By the time dawn stretched its pale fingers through the trees, she had convinced herself it was nothing, a dream, a trick of the mind. She had been wound too tight after the meeting at the church, and it had bled into her sleep. At least, that's what she told herself as she got dressed. Her father had already gone when she stepped into the kitchen, his chair empty, his coat missing from the hook by the door. Gone to the mine early, no doubt. Eileen poured herself a drink, dark and strong. She barely tasted it. Margaret Bellamy's words gnawed at her skull. I heard laughter. Widow Callahan's warning followed close behind. They do not forget. She shook her head. Enough of this. She needed air. Eileen found Clara sitting on the Bellamy porch, knees drawn to her chest, arms wrapped around them. She looked worse than the day before. Dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept either. Eileen hesitated before stepping forward. Clara? Clara lifted her head. Eileen sat beside her. The wood crackling beneath their weight. The air was cold, the kind of cold that clung to the bones, refusing to leave. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then Clara exhaled shakily. Mama's been talking to herself, she murmured. Keeps setting an extra plate at the table. Says we can't let Jacob feel unwelcome. Eileen felt a pang of grief twist inside her. She reached out, squeezing Clara's arm gently. I'm sorry. Clara's fingers dug into her knees. She says he's still here, that if we listen close, we'll hear him laughing. Eileen swallowed hard. She thought of the whisper outside her window. She thought of the feeling, the certainty that something had been watching. Clara turned to her, eyes red-rimmed and shining. You don't believe in it, do you? Eileen hesitated. Did she? Before last night she would have said no. But now there was a small, cold seed of doubt curling in her chest. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could, Clara suddenly grabbed her wrist, fingers tight. If you hear something, Clara. If you hear something, Clara whispered, voice barely more than a breath. Don't speak back. Eileen's blood went cold. Clara licked her lips, glancing at the trees like she was afraid they might hear her. Mama says, that's how they know, she whispered. That's how they know who to take next. Eileen pulled her hand back. The porch felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. This was ridiculous. She forced a laugh, shaking her head. Clara, you don't actually believe that, do you? Clara didn't answer. She just looked at her. Eileen stood. She needed to move, to shake off the way Clara's words were crawling under her skin. I have to go, she said quickly. I'll see you later tonight, all right? Clara just nodded, gaze still distant. As Eileen turned to leave, she caught the last words Clara muttered under her breath, so quiet she almost missed them. They already know your name. Eileen stiffened. Then she walked away without looking back. The sun was setting by the time Eileen made her way home. She had spent most of the day trying to shake off the conversation with Clara. She had walked the length of the town twice, stopped by the general store for some things she didn't really need, and even lingered near the church, where a few women were discussing another search party for Jacob. But the unease never left her. Now, as she neared the cabin, the trees stood tall and dark around her, the branches clawing at the deepening sky. The path home was familiar, well worn by years. But tonight something felt different. She quickened her pace. The cabin was just ahead, a warm glow flickering behind the window. Her father was home. She exhaled in relief, then froze. Somewhere behind her, deep in the trees, a branch snapped. Eileen turned sharply. The woods stood silent. The wind murmured through the leaves, dry and whispering. The last light of the sun bled through the gaps, beneath and between the trunks. Stretching the shadows long and thin, she scanned the tree line, searching. Nothing. And yet, that feeling crept up her spine. That feeling of being watched. Her pulse quickened. It's just the wind, she muttered under her breath. Say it out loud. Make it real. She took a step forward, then movement. A shift just at the end of her vision. She jerked her head towards it, her breath catching. And there, between the trees, stood something. It was tall. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It was impossibly thin, stretched like a shadow against the dark bark. But she could feel it watching. A chill seeped into her bones. The hollow folk. No, no. It's trick of the light. It was all a tree bent in an odd angle, a tangle of branches catching the dim glow. Then it tilted its head. Eileen's stomach dropped. She took a slow step backwards towards the cabin. The thing did not move, but the air between them felt wrong, like the space itself was bending, warping. A breath held too long, a silent stretch, too thin. Eileen's fingers twitched towards the door handle. She didn't blink, didn't breathe. Then it smiled. Not on its face. It had no face. The smile appeared beneath it, stretching across its own shadow. Wide, sharp, too many teeth. The breath left Eileen's lungs, and then the whisper, soft, gentle, familiar. Eileen. Her name curling through the wind like a hand reaching for her throat. Eileen wrenched open the door and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. She stood there, chest heaving, heart pounding. The fire crackled in the hearth. The warmth of the cabin pressed against her back. She forced herself to turn, to look out the window. The tree line was still. The thing was gone. But as she stared into the woods, her father's words came crawling back. You don't have to believe in something for it to be real. Eileen O'Shea did not believe in the hollow folk, but tonight, for the first time in her life, she was afraid of them. Chapter 2. The Debt Unpaid. Eileen barely slept. She lay stiff in bed, wide-eyed, the quilt pulled up to her chin. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of wind against the window made her heart jump. The things in the woods, the thing that whispered her name, had vanished when she ran inside. But she knew it hadn't left. It was still out there, waiting. By dawn, she gave up on sleep altogether. She pulled on her boots, splashed cold water on her face, and stepped into the kitchen to find her father already awake, sitting at the table, a cigarette smoldering between his fingers. That was unusual. Seamus O'Shea wasn't a morning smoker. He glanced up as she entered, his gaze flicking over her face. You look like hell. Eileen sat down across from him, rubbing her arms. Didn't sleep well. Her father didn't say anything, just took a slow drag off his cigarette, exhaled through his nose. For a moment they sat in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of the wind outside. Finally, Eileen spoke. Pa? He looked at her. She swallowed. Did you ever hear things when you were young? His expression didn't change, but he tapped his cigarette against the ashtray a little too hard. Eileen leaned forward. You believe in him, don't you? Seamus sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. Eileen, don't lie to me. Her voice was sharper than she meant it to be. Not about this. Her father was quiet for a long time. Then he reached for his whiskey bottle. That was answer enough. Eileen's stomach twisted. Pa. He poured a measure into his coffee, staring at the table. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. My grandfather, he said. He was the first O'Shea to come here. Left Ireland when he was a boy. Eileen waited. Seamus took a sip of the whiskey-laced coffee. He never talked about why, but I heard my father say once it wasn't just the famine that sent him running. Eileen frowned. Then what? Seamus's fingers curled around his cup. A debt. The words sat heavy in the air between them. Eileen felt her skin prickle. What kind of debt? Seamus exhaled through his nose. One that followed him across the ocean. The room felt colder. Eileen shook her head. You mean the hollow folk? Her father murmured. Whatever they were before. He made a bargain with them back in Ireland. He didn't keep his end. The words made her chest tighten. They came with us? Widow Callahan's voice echoed in her mind. Eileen licked her lips. What was the bargain? Seamus's jaw tightened. He shook his head. I don't know, he admitted. If my grandfather ever told anyone, they didn't pass it down. But the debt, it didn't die with him. Eileen gripped the edge of the table. The hollow folk don't forget. She thought of the thing in the woods, the whisper in the night. They're still collecting, she realized. Seamus's silence was enough of an answer for her. Eileen swallowed hard, her hands cold against the worn wood. It had been generations, and the hollow folk were still waiting for their due. Eileen felt lightheaded. She gripped the edge of the table, her father's words rattling inside her skull. A bargain, dead on paid, didn't die with him. She exhaled sharply, pushing back from the table. This is madness, Pa. Seamus didn't answer. Eileen stood pacing the length of the kitchen. The old wooden floor creaked under her boots. How could that even work? She demanded. A man makes a deal back in Ireland, runs across the ocean, and it follows him? That's not how things work. Seamus finally looked at her. His face was tired, older than it should have been. You think time and distance mean anything to them that make these deals? Eileen swallowed. The words sent an ugly chill down her spine. She shook her head, crossing her arms. Maybe he owed money. Maybe he crossed the wrong men and got it twisted in some ghost story along the way. Seamus exhaled slowly. I heard them, Eileen. Her pulse skipped. Seamus stared down at his coffee, his voice lower now. I was your age. The whispers, the laughter, same as you. Eileen stiffened. Her father met her eyes. That's why I've never left this place, you understand. This debt, whatever it is, it's in the blood. Doesn't matter where you go. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. The hollow folk don't forget. She sat back down, her hands clammy. What happens if we don't pay? Seamus didn't answer right away. He took another slow sip of coffee. His knuckles were white where they gripped the cup. Then, finally, they take. The words were barely a whisper. Eileen shivered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth. The clock on the wall ticked slowly and steadily forward. Eileen licked her lips. If we don't even know what the bargain was, how in the hell are we supposed to make it right? Seamus sighed through his nose. We don't. The finality in his voice made her chest tighten. She stared at him. You're saying we just wait? Hope it's not our turn next? Her father's face was grim. Eileen pushed up from the table, her chair scraping against the wood. No, she muttered, shaking her head. No, that's not good enough. She turned towards the door, grabbing her coat from the hook. Seamus frowned. Where are you going? Eileen shoved her arms through the sleeves. If the old folks in town believe in this nonsense, then someone must know something useful. Her father's voice sharpened. Eileen, I'm not sitting here waiting for them to come knocking, Pa. Seamus exhaled hard through his nose, pinching the bridge. He muttered something in Gaelic under his breath, something she didn't understand, but she knew it was a curse. Eileen pulled the door open, stepping onto the porch. The morning air was cold and sharp. The trees stood still. She hesitated, glancing towards the woods. The same woods where she had seen it. A shadow too thin, a smile in the wrong place. A whisper curling through the dark. Eileen. She swallowed hard. Then she squared her shoulders and started towards town. She wasn't going to wait for the hollow folk to come for her. She was going to find them first. Eileen walked fast. The trees loomed on either side of the dirt path, their bare branches reaching overhead like twisted fingers. The morning sun should have burned away the chill from her bones, but it didn't, because now she knew. The whispers were the thing in the woods. The way her father refused to speak plainly, it all pointed to something that had been here before her, before him, before any of them. A debt unpaid, a promise unfulfilled, and they were still collecting. She reached the Bellamy house before she even realized her feet had taken her there. Margaret Bellamy was standing in the yard, wringing out a damp sheet between her hands. She looked wrong. Her hair was unbrushed, her dress half-buttoned, lips chapped and crackled like she'd been whispering to herself all night. Clara was nowhere to be seen. Eileen hesitated. Margaret's red-rimmed eyes flicked, looking up to her. "You come to ask about my Jacob?" Eileen's breath caught. Margaret's voice was too steady. Not grieving, not lost, just something else. Something that made her hairs on the back of Eileen's neck stand on end. She forced herself to nod. Margaret exhaled through her nose. "Everyone thinks he's dead." Eileen swallowed. But I know better." Margaret let the sheet fall to the ground. She took a slow step forward, her hands trembling. "My boy's still here," she murmured. Eileen's pulse quickened. Margaret's crackling lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "He talks to me at night." Eileen's stomach twitched a little more. Margaret stepped closer. "He laughs, just like before." Eileen forced herself to hold her ground. "Margaret." "He knocks on the walls," Margaret whispered, "right outside my window. Sometimes I almost see him, just there, between the trees." Eileen clenched her jaw. It sounded like grief. It should have been grief. But there was something too certain in Margaret's voice, something that didn't belong in mourning. Something close to devotion. Eileen licked her lips. "Margaret, you saw him?" Margaret's face shifted. Her eyes flicked away just for a second, like she was afraid of what would happen if she said yes. Eileen felt something cold grip her spine. Margaret turned away, reaching for the sheet again. Her hands still shook, but she spoke lightly, as if they were discussing the weather. "They always come back, you know." Eileen's breath caught. Margaret smoothed the damp fabric between her fingers. "Not the way they were, but they come back." A lump formed in Eileen's throat. Her voice was hoarse when she finally spoke. "Who?" Margaret didn't answer. Eileen wasn't even sure she had heard her, because suddenly Margaret's gaze snapped towards the tree line, her breath hitching like she had just heard something, like something was standing just beyond the trees. Her lips parted. Then she smiled. Eileen didn't turn to look. She couldn't, because deep down she already knew it was there. Eileen left the Bellamy house as quickly as she could without running. Margaret hadn't stopped smiling. Even when Eileen stepped off the porch, even when she backed away, Margaret had just stood there staring towards the woods, listening to something that wasn't there. Or maybe it was. Eileen didn't look. She walked fast through town, trying to shake the cold weight in her stomach. Margaret's words clung to her, tangled in her thoughts like burrs. "They always come back. Not the way they were." She didn't realize she had turned onto the road leading to the old McGowan house before she saw it looming up ahead. The McGowan family had left town years ago. Packed up in the dead of night, no warning, no goodbyes. Their house still stood, half swallowed by the ivy and rot. Eileen had always thought it was strange, the way no one moved in after them. But now, with everything she knew, everything she had seen, she wondered if people simply knew better. She hesitated at the threshold. The door was slightly open, not broken, not hanging off its hinges, just a little open. Like someone had stepped inside and forgotten to close it. The wind stirred, the trees rustled. Eileen swallowed hard. She shouldn't go in. Every bone in her body told her not to go in. She stepped forward anyway. Inside, dust floated in the dim light. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. Furniture sat still where it had always been. Chairs tucked under the table. Clocks stopped mid-tick. Picture frames still hanging from the walls. As if the McGowans had simply vanished. Eileen's stomach twisted. She took another step forward, her boots scuffing against the wood floors. Something clattered. Eileen froze. The sound had come from the hall. She turned slowly. The pulse began to hammer. The hallway stretched into the shadow. Doors lined both sides, slightly ajar. For a long moment she didn't move. Then a whisper. Not words, not quite. A sound barely there, curling through the dust-heavy air. Her skin prickled. She stepped closer. The door at the very end stood wider than the rest. A bedroom, probably. The whispering stopped. Eileen reached the threshold. The air shifted. And then the toys. Scattered across the floor. Wooden figures, marbles. A hand-sewn doll, its button eye glinting in the faint light. All arranged like someone had just been playing with them. Eileen's breath caught. She knew this house had been empty for years. She knew no one had stepped inside since the McGowans left, and yet the dust around the toys had been disturbed. Small footprints. A child's footprints. She took a slow step back. The air pressed against her ears, thick and heavy. The shadow seemed to shift, stretching toward her like a hungry hand. Eileen turned sharply and walked out, not running, not quite. Just fast enough that whatever was inside the house knew she wasn't going to wait for it to follow. Eileen didn't stop walking until the McGowan house was far behind her. She kept her eyes forward, hands clenched into fists at her sides. The town sat just ahead, the church steeple, the line of cabins, the distant smoke curling from the chimneys. Normal things, really. But the whisper in her ears, the feeling crawling beneath her skin, that wasn't so easy to leave behind. She had seen those toys, those footprints. Jacob Bellamy had vanished just days ago. The McGowans had been gone for years. And yet there had been fresh dust. Fresh footprints. As if someone had just been there, moments ago. Eileen swallowed hard. Didn't make sense. None of this made sense. She needed answers. Real answers, and there was only one person in town who might have them. Widow Callahan. She veered towards the church, her boots kicking up dry leaves. The sun was dipping low in the sky now, stretching the shadows long across the dirt road. The air was colder than it had been that morning, like the season had shifted in just a few short hours. Then, a sound. A soft, distant giggle. Eileen stopped in her tracks. The trees loomed beside the road, dark and quiet. The wind rustled through the branches, leaves whispering against one another. Then, laughter. High and light, like a child's. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She turned her head slowly, heart pounding. The wood stood still. She strained her ears, but nothing. Eileen let out a shaky breath, forcing herself to move again. But she had only taken a few steps when Eileen. The whisper curled around her name, thin and breathless. It didn't come from behind her. It didn't come from in front of her. It came from above. Eileen's breath caught. She tilted her head upward, and there, perched in the branches of an old sycamore, was a figure. Small. And watching. It sat among the tangled limbs, like it had always been there, its head tilted too far to one side. Its body was too thin, its arms and legs too long, and its face, no, it wasn't Jacob. It looked like Jacob, but its eyes were too small, too hollow. It smiled, a long, thin grin, not on its face, but in its shadow, stretched wide across the tree trunk. Then it laughed, soft, sweet, like a child who had just been told a secret. Eileen stumbled back. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She turned and ran. The wind picked up behind her, carrying the laughter with it, thin, distant, almost human, but not quite. Not quite. Chapter 3. The Marked. Eileen didn't stop running until she reached her cabin. Her chest ached, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with shaking hands. The wind howled outside, the trees rustled, but there was no laughter now. No whisper calling her name, only silence. She pressed her back against the door, squeezing her eyes shut. It wasn't Jacob. It couldn't have been. She had seen its eyes, and its shadow. She sucked in a shaky breath, forcing her legs to move. The cabin was dim, the last light of the sun casting long shapes across the wooden floor. Her father's coat still hung on the hook, but he wasn't home. Probably still at the mine. Probably working late, as he often did. Eileen moved towards the table, her hands numb. She pulled out a chair and sat down hard. Her fingers were trembling. She clenched them into fists. She needed to think. Widow Callahan. That was still the plan. She would go to the old woman first thing in the morning and demand to know everything. No more riddles, no more warnings with half answers, because this thing in the trees with Jacob's voice and a shadow that moved on its own, it was real, and it was here, and it was watching her. Eileen exhaled, rubbing her face. It was watching her. She needed sleep. The dreams came quick and sharp, fingers curling around her wrist, a whisper at her ear, laughter thin and brittle as dry leaves, a pressure against her skin, gripping, holding, refusing to let go. Eileen gasped awake. The cabin was dark. The fire had burned low in the hearth, faint embers glowing in the ashes. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Something felt wrong. Her wrist ached. Slowly, stiffly, she lifted her arm, squinting in the dim light. A bruise, dark, thin, wrapped tight around her wrist, like the shape of a hand that was too long, a hand that had never been there at all. Eileen's stomach twisted. A breeze whispered against the cabin walls, and from somewhere outside the window, the sound of laughter. Eileen left at first light. She barely touched her breakfast, barely spoke to her father. He had come home late, and when he saw the bruises on her wrist, his face darkened, but he didn't ask. Maybe he didn't need to. Maybe he already knew. The morning air was sharp as a knife's edge as she walked through town. People moved about their daily routines, fetching water, chopping wood, but no one met her eye. She knew why. Margaret Bellamy's whispers had spread. They knew she had seen something. They knew better than to ask. The widow's house sat at the far end of town, half swallowed by ivy and thyme. Eileen had always found it unsettling. The old Celtic symbols carved into the wooden beams, the way the crows always circled above it, but never landed. She reached the door, hesitated for only a moment, and then knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Widow Callahan. The door creaked open. Not fully, just a crack, like it had been waiting. Eileen swallowed hard and stepped inside. The room was dim, the heavy curtains drawn, herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with a sharp, earthy scent. Candles flickered on every surface, their flames low and wavering. At the far end of the room, the Widow Callahan sat in her rocking chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were already on Eileen like she had known she was coming. Eileen shivered. "You saw them," the widow said softly. It wasn't a question. Eileen hesitated. Then finally she nodded. Callahan exhaled, long and slow. She gestured to the table. "Sit then." Eileen obeyed, her legs stiff, her wrists still aching. The old woman studied her for a long while, then reached forward, taking Eileen's hand in her own. Her fingers were as cold as river stones. She turned Eileen's wrist, frowning at the bruise. "They've marked you." Eileen's stomach tightened. The widow's thumb brushed over the dark imprint. "You woke with this, then?" Eileen nodded again. Callahan sighed through her nose. "Then it's too late for warnings." Eileen's pulse quickened. "I don't want warnings. I want answers." Callahan's lips pressed together. She let go of Eileen's wrist and leaned back into the chair, the candlelight flickering across her weathered face. "There was a bargain," she said, "long ago. A promise made and broken. And you, child of O'Shea, were always meant to pay it." Eileen's breath caught. Callahan's gaze didn't waver. "They know your name, girl." Her voice dropped lower, barely above a whisper. "And once the hollow folk know your name, they do not let go." Eileen's hands curled into fists. "There has to be a way to stop this," she said, more desperate than she wanted to sound. Callahan didn't blink. "There is." Eileen leaned forward. "What?" The widow's eyes gleamed in the candlelight. "You tell them how to break the debt." The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. Eileen swallowed. "And if I don't know?" Callahan didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "Then they will take you." Eileen exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. The widow studied her, then sighed. "You should leave," she murmured. "Tonight. As far as you can." Eileen's pulse pounded, but Callahan's voice was distant and tired. "They'll follow, of course, but maybe not right away." The candle flickered, and the room seemed to darken. Eileen's fingers trembled against the wood. She knew it was useless. They had marked her, and the hollow folk never forgot a name. Eileen barely remembered leaving the widow's house. Her legs carried her back into town, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning and unraveling. "Tell them how to break the debt." The words gnawed at her. How in the hells was she supposed to answer that? She didn't even know what the debt was. Her great-grandfather had made a deal back in Ireland, had fled across the ocean, thinking he could escape it. But the hollow folk had followed, or had been here. I don't know. And now they wanted their due. And they thought she had the answer. Eileen rubbed the bruise on her wrist. It ached, a deep, cold ache that didn't fade. She needed time to think, to figure out if there was a way out of this. The sun slipped lower when she finally reached the cabin. The door stood shut, the windows dark, her father still at the mine. She exhaled shakily, stepping onto the porch. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. She turned it. The door swung inward, unlocked. Eileen froze. Her father always locked the door. Always. Her stomach twisted. Slowly she stepped inside, but the air was wrong. The fire had burned low in the hearth. The smell of ash was thick in the air. Chairs were still in place, but the table was untouched. Nothing had been taken, and yet Eileen felt it. Something had been there. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her throat. The floorboards creaked, not beneath her, behind her. Eileen spun. The door stood open. The wind stirred the trees, rustling through the leaves. She stood a step forward, gripping the edge of the door. Beyond the porch, the wood stretched into shadow. The path home, the path to town, the path to them. The door had been left open like an invitation. Eileen swallowed hard. Then slowly she shut it and slid the bolt into place. Eileen didn't light the lanterns. She didn't move for a long time. Standing with her back pressed against the door, listening, the house was silent. But outside, the trees rustled, the wind sighed, and beneath it, something softer. Not whispers, not laughter, breathing. Eileen's stomach knotted. She forced herself away from the door, one slow step at a time. Her hands found the table, the solid wood grounding her. Think. She needed to think. She was already marked. The widow had made that clear. Running wouldn't help. Hiding wouldn't help. They wanted something. And if she didn't find out what, they would take her. Eileen exhaled slowly. A shadow flickered past the window. She sucked the breath, in a breath, fingers tightening on the table's edge. The light outside was nearly gone, the sun sinking behind the shadows. The trees stood in the silhouette, long and jagged. In the dying light, a figure, small, still, standing at the tree line. Eileen's blood turned to ice. She knew who it looked like. Her pulse slammed against her ribs. She took a slow step forward towards the window, unable to stop herself. The figure didn't move. She could see him clearly now. Small shoulders, dark curls. His face half lit by the last breath of daylight. Jacob. It was Jacob. Except, again, his eyes were too dark, two pits of endless shadow like the place where light went to die. His mouth twitched upward, a grin, small, subtle, and wrong. The trees swayed, the wind howled, and Jacob lifted a hand, a slow, deliberate motion, and waved. Eileen staggered back from the window. Her breath came short and sharp. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It isn't him. It isn't him. It isn't. The sound of bare feet on the porch. A light knock at the door. Eileen's stomach lurched. She backed away. Another knock. Soft, patient. And then, "Miss Eileen." Jacob's voice, perfect, unchanged. Eileen clamped a hand over her mouth. She knew. She knew if she opened the door, if she spoke to it, it would not be Jacob standing there. She clenched her eyes shut. The wind pressed against the cabin walls. The fire crackled low in the hearth. And from the other side of the door, "Let me in." Eileen didn't move. She didn't breathe. The door stood between her and it, between her and whatever was waiting on the other side. "Miss Eileen," the voice said again. It was softer now, a boy's voice, small and uncertain. "I don't know where I am." A lump rose in her throat. It sounded so real, so much like Jacob. But she had seen its eyes. She had seen its shadowy smile. Eileen squeezed her hands into fists. She wouldn't answer. She wouldn't. The wood beneath her feet creaked. The cabin walls felt too thin. Another knock. 3 light taps. "I want to come home." Eileen shut her eyes. Her mother used to say that words had power, that to speak was to give it to was that to speak to something was to give it permission. She had never believed it, but she wasn't about to test it now. Silence stretched long between them. Then the thing outside sighed. Soft and slow, like a man settling into a chair after a long day. Then it spoke again, but it wasn't Jacob's voice anymore. It was lower, thinner, a breath through the keyhole. "Eileen O'Shea," it whispered. Her voice and breath hitched. It knew her name. The air in the room thickened. The fire burned lower, the candlelight flickering. "It's time." The words slithered into her ears, curling around her bones like cold fingers. She bit down hard on the inside of her cheek. Outside, the wind picked up. The knock came again, but this time the door shuddered. Not a knock, a push, testing the lock, testing her. Eileen's heart slammed against her ribs. She turned, grabbed the poker from the hearth. The whispering stopped. For a long, stretched moment, there was nothing but wind. Then the door handle twisted. Eileen's pulse roared in her ears. She gripped the poker tight. The handle jerked. The door creaked against the bolt. The beat of silence. Then laughter. Low, thin, amused. Not from the door, from the window. Eileen turned sharply, her breath catching, but the window was empty. Only the trees swayed in the dying light. The laughter drifted, fading into the wind. Then, at last, silence. Eileen stood there, her pulse pounding. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Then she slowly, carefully stepped towards the door and pressed her palm against it. The wood was cold. Whatever had been there, it was gone now, but not for long. Eileen knew that. Deep in her bones, she knew something else too. They weren't just waiting anymore. They were coming, and next time, they wouldn't knock. Chapter 4. Into the Hollow. The next morning, Eileen found her father outside chopping wood. She hesitated on the porch, watching him. His movements were steady, methodical, the rhythm of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. But his shoulders were tense, like he already knew. Eileen stepped off the porch, walking towards him. Seamus split another log down the middle. He didn't look up. "You look like hell." Eileen huffed. "Not sleeping will do that." Seamus exhaled through his nose. He set another log on the stump. Eileen crossed her arms. "Something was here last night." Seamus didn't flinch. Didn't stop working. She took a step closer. "It spoke to me." The axe came down, maybe harder than was necessary. The wood cracked apart, splinters flying. Still, he said nothing. Eileen clenched her fists. "I want the truth, Pa. All of it." Seamus wiped the sweat from his brow, finally meeting her gaze. His expression was tired. You won't like it. I don't care. A long silence stretched between them. Then Seamus exhaled sharply and set the axe down. He gestured towards the porch. Come inside. The cabin was dim, the fire still burning low in the hearth. Seamus poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one in front of Eileen before sitting heavily across from her. His hands curled around his mug, but he didn't drink. For a moment, he just stared at it. Then he spoke. There's no stopping him. Eileen's stomach twisted again, for what felt like the millionth time in the last couple days. She forced her voice to stay steady. The widow said there's a way. Seamus let out a dry, humorless laugh. Is that what she told you? Eileen's hands clenched against the table. She said I have to tell them how to break the debt. Seamus went still. A flicker of something, pain, or maybe regret, crossed his face. Then he sighed. He rubbed his hand over his face. That's the cruelest part of all, Eileen. Her throat tightened. What is? Her father's gaze lifted to hers. They ask a question, he said. A simple question. The fire popped in the hearth. The wind whispered against the window. Eileen's pulse thudded in her ears. Seamus leaned forward, his voice low. Tell us how to break the debt. A lump formed in Eileen's throat. Her father's knuckles were white around his mug. And when you have no answer, he swallowed hard, they take you. The word sent an ugly chill through her bones. Eileen gripped the edge of the table. There has to be a way. There isn't. Seamus's voice was flat. He finally met her eyes. And if you think otherwise, you're a damn fool. Eileen stared at him. Her father, the man who had raised her, taught her, protected her, had given up. A slow, cold anger curled inside her chest. She pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. I'm not giving in. Seamus exhaled sharply, shaking his head. It's not about giving in, girl. It's about what's already been decided. The best you can do is stay safe. Eileen turned towards the door. Her father's voice stopped her. I told you to leave, he muttered. She looked over her shoulder. Seamus's jaw was tight. You should have listened. Eileen swallowed the lump in her throat. Then she stepped outside, slamming the door behind her. Eileen made her way into town, her mind racing. She needed answers. Her father was convinced it was hopeless, and Widow Callahan spoke in riddles. The town whispered behind closed doors, but never spoke plainly. Somebody had to know the truth. If there was one man in town who didn't believe in legends, who would be forced to explain things in a way that made sense, it was Eli Sheriff Turner. Sheriff. His office sat near the general store, a squat wooden building with a single holding cell that rarely saw use. She pushed the door open without knocking, and Sheriff Turner sat behind his desk. His feet kicked up, a cigarette hanging from his lips. He raised an eyebrow as she stormed in. Well, look who it is. Eileen slammed her hands down on the desk. The sheriff didn't flinch. I need answers. Eli exhaled a long stream of smoke. Well, good morning to you, too. Eileen ignored him. You were at the church. You heard what Margaret said. You heard Callahan. Eli sighed, sitting up. Eileen, I told you before. I saw something, she interrupted. That made him pause. Eileen's heart pounded. I saw something in the woods, Sheriff. It looked like Jacob, but it was not. And it came to my door last night. Eli studied her face, his own unreadable. Eileen leaned forward. You don't believe in this stuff. Fine. But people are disappearing. And I think you know more than you let on. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his temple. Eileen. Tell me, she snapped. Silence stretched between them. Then finally, Eli exhaled through his nose. You know my uncle, yeah? Eileen frowned. Harlan? Eli nodded. She remembered Harlan Turner. He used to own the sawmill before his mind went soft. He had a sharp, once loud, and steady mind. But something had changed him. Eileen had seen him a few months back sitting outside the general store. His eyes had been wrong, empty like a man who had seen something too big to explain. Eli drummed his fingers against the desk. He was a miner when he was young, the sheriff said, before he bought the mill. Eileen's pulse quickened. Eli leaned forward, lowering into his voice. And one day, he went down into that mine like usual. Eileen swallowed. But when he came back up, Eli shook his head. He wasn't the same. A chill crawled up Eileen's spine. He said he saw something, Eli muttered, down there in the dark. Eileen gripped the desk. Saw what? Eli hesitated, then finally, he wouldn't say. Eileen exhaled sharply. Eli tapped the cigarette against the ashtray. Just kept muttering about a deal made long ago and how the debt always comes due. Eileen's could feel the muscles in her jaw clench. The sheriff studied her. I don't know what you saw, he said finally. I don't know if I want to. Eileen's hands clenched into fists. But I do know this. Eli's voice dropped lower. That's mine. That mine is where a lot of all this started, if you ask me. Eileen's breath caught again. Eli leaned back, his expression grim. And if you're looking for answers, he exhaled a slow stream of smoke, you'd best start digging there. Eileen left the sheriff's office with a lead weight in her chest. The mine. She'd always known it was part of the town's history. Every family had men who had worked there, men who had been buried there even. But if what the sheriff said was true, if the dead is somehow connected to there, then it was more than just history. It was the root. She made her way toward Widow Callahan's house. She wasn't in the mood for riddles, but the old woman knew things. If she knew about the debt, then maybe she knew what had been buried down there. The door was already open when she arrived, just like before, like it had been waiting. Eileen stepped inside. The air smelled of herbs and candle wax again. The widow sat in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. She was staring at the fire, like she had been expecting her. Eileen swallowed. The mine. Callahan exhaled slowly. She didn't look at her. So you figured some things out on your own. Eileen's pulse quickened. Tell me. The widow reached for a small bundle of dried sage, rolling it between her fingers. The men who came before us, she murmured. The ones who dug first into that mountain for coal. Eileen frowned. Callahan finally turned her gaze upon her. Well, they found more than coal, she said softly. They found the old gods of this land. And they found the gods of a land they thought they had left behind. Eileen's stomach twisted. They disturbed the hollow folk, Callahan continued. They woke something that some of them had crossed in the past, and that they had thought was no longer a threat. Men like my father, Thomas Callahan, or Old Man McGowan, Bentback Bellamy, and your own great-grandpap, Mr. O'Shea. Eileen gripped the back of the chair. What did they do? She asked. The widow sighed, rubbing her temple. They tried to make peace there in the mountain. Eileen's pulse hammered. There was a ritual. Some knew, Callahan said. A way to keep them satisfied. But it's been forgotten or ignored. A lump formed in Eileen's throat, and now the hollow folk were waiting. The debt was still unpaid. Eileen swallowed hard. What was the ritual? Callahan studied her, then slowly shook her head. I just said no one remembers. Eileen's stomach dropped. A leaden silence stretched between them. Then Callahan exhaled, slow and steady. But the answers, Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "They are down there, as they were the first time they dug into that mountain." The fire crackled. The wind pressed against the window. Eileen clenched her fist. She knew what she had to do. She had to go to the mine. Eileen left Widow Callahan's house with her heart pounding. The mine. It was always the mine. Something had been disturbed there. A ritual had been forgotten. And now the hollow folk were waiting to collect on a debt that her ancestors never thought would be called in. Her feet carried her towards home before she even realized it. The sky was darkening, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. She would go to the mine tomorrow. For now, she just needed to get inside, to think again, to breathe. The cabin room loomed ahead, the porch creaking under her boots. She opened the door and stepped inside. The fire had burned low. Shadows stretched long across the wooden floor. Her father's coat still hung by the door, but Seamus was nowhere to be seen. Eileen swallowed hard. She shut the door behind her, sliding the bolt into place. The silence pressed in. She took a slow step forward, then a soft tap. Eileen froze. It came again. A light, deliberate sound. A knocking, but not from the door, from a window. Slowly, so slowly, she turned. A shape stood outside the glass. Not her father, not an animal, something else. Tall, thin, wrong. The light from the dying fire flickered over it, shifting its form. A shadow where a face should be, a breath of wind in the shape of a man. It lifted one long, spindly hand and knocked again. Tap, tap, tap. Eileen's pulse slammed in her throat. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching, waiting. Then, without a sound, it smiled. Not on its face, but in its shadow. And then it whispered her name. Eileen. She stood frozen. The thing at the window didn't move, didn't breathe. It only smiled, that terrible, gaping grin stretching across its shadowed face. Eileen. Her name slid through the glass like a breath, soft and patient. It knew she was there. It knew she was listening. Her fingers curled tight around the edge of the table. She wanted to run, wanted to shut her eyes and to pretend it wasn't there, but she couldn't. She forced herself to look at it. She couldn't just make out the shape of it. She could see its limbs too long, its head slightly tilted, its body shifting between the shadows like it was made of the mist. And beneath it, that smile. Too sharp. Too wide. Eileen's breath came shallow. She didn't speak. She wouldn't. The fire popped low in the hearth. The wind rattled the shutters. The thing knocked on the glass again. Tap, tap, tap. The pulse in her neck hammered away. Then it took a slow, shuddering step backward, its shadow stretching unnaturally, twisting across the ground. And then it lifted its hand. It pointed. Eileen's stomach turned to ice. The mine. It was pointing toward the mine. The whisper came again, low, curling, through the air like dead leaves. It's time. Eileen swallowed hard. She knew what it meant. No more waiting, no more running. Tomorrow she would go to the mine, because they were done knocking. They were calling her home. Chapter 5. Blood Price. The entrance to the old mine loomed before Eileen like a black mouth, yawning open into the earth. The wind had picked up as she made her way up the ridge, whistling through the wind whistling through the trees, stirring the loose rocks at her feet. Her father had left for work before dawn. She had waited for him to go. She didn't want to tell him where she was going. She didn't want him to try to stop her. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. Most of the mine had been abandoned for years. The older shafts had collapsed, and the newer ones, where her father still worked, had been carved deeper into the mountain. But this was where it had started. So Eileen stepped forward, her boots crunching over loose stone. The air grew colder as she neared the entrance, thick with the scent of damp earth and rusting iron. The wooden beams bracing the tunnel were slick with moss, old and rotting. The place felt wrong. Not empty, waiting. Eileen hesitated at the threshold. Then, before she could second-guess herself, she stepped outside. The dark swallowed her whole. The deeper she went, the heavier the air became. Dust hung thick in the beams of her lantern. The walls dripped with moisture, the stones slick and cold beneath her fingertips. Eileen's breath came slow and steady. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that the answers were down here. She moved carefully, her boots skimming the edge of old tracks. Her father had told her once that this part of the mine had been closed off after a collapse, but now the entrance was open. Someone had been here, or something. The tunnel stretched long and winding, and then her foot hit something solid. Eileen lifted her lantern. A wooden crate, old, dust-covered. She knelt, brushing the dirt from the surface. The lid was already loose. She pried it open. Inside were ledgers, stacks of old papers, edges curled with age. The ink had faded, but as she lifted one out, she could still make the writing. Names, numbers, records of workers. She flipped the pages, scanning the old names. O'Shea, Bellamy, McGowan. The same names of families that still lived here. Her stomach twisted, and then her fingers stilled. A different entry, one that wasn't like the others. Debt recorded. Payment pending. Her pulse quickened. There were no numbers beside it, no names, just those words, and beneath them a symbol, not English, not letters at all, like a carving of something, something not meant to be written. Her hands went clammy. Eileen exhaled, staring at the mark, her breath curling white in the freezing air. Then a sound, gentle, soft, a whisper. Eileen. Her blood ran cold. It was coming from deeper inside the mine, waiting, calling, laughing. Her breath hitched. The whisper curled around the tunnel, threading through the beams and rusting tracks like it belonged there, like it had never left. Eileen. Soft, familiar, wrong. She forced herself to move, shoving the old ledger into her coat. She turned the lantern forward. The tunnel stretched on, winding deeper into the dark. The whisper came again, closer. Her pulse hammered on. She gritted her teeth, pressing forward. She had come this far. She wasn't leaving without the truth. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Eileen slowed, lifting her lantern high. The walls were smoother, not carved by tools but something older, and water dripped from the ceiling, pooling between jagged stones. Rusted mining carts sat overturned, their contents long gone, and on the far wall, Eileen's breath caught. A mark, like the one in the ledger, scratched deep into the stone. No, not scratched, carved. She stepped forward. The symbol was bigger than the one in the ledger, taller than she was even, and beneath it, a name. She swallowed hard, reaching out. The letters were faint, worn by time, but she could still read them. C. O'Shea. Her stomach twisted. An ancestor, one of her own, the man who made the deal. Eileen stepped back, breath coming short. This was it. This was where her ancestor had come back in contact with those whom he had struck the deal. And now the hollow folk were here, still, waiting. The air thickened. Her lantern flickered. And from the darkness behind her, a whisper. The debt is due. The flame snuffed out. The dark swallowed her whole. The lantern died. The darkness closed in. Eileen's pulse slammed against her ribs. She staggered backward, her boots scraping over loose stone. The cold pressed in, thick as river water. The whisper came again, not from one voice, but from many. The debt is due. The debt is due. She reached into her coat, fumbling for matches. Her fingers shook as she struck one against the crate. A small flame flared to life, and in the weak glow she saw them, the hollow folk. They stood at the edges of the chamber, tall and thin, their limbs too long, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. They had no faces, only shifting, rippling darkness where features should be. But their shadows grinned, wide and sharp, like something hungry. Eileen's breath came short. She clutched the match tighter. One of them stepped forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. The others followed, their bodies gliding over the uneven ground. The match burned slower. A voice curled through the air. Eileen O'Shea. It was barely a whisper. It was a name spoken with purpose, a claim. Eileen's throat tightened. What do you want? The nearest figure tilted its head. Then it lifted a hand. A long, spindly hand, its fingers ending in fine points, and it pointed at her. Give us what was promised. Eileen's stomach churned. She forced herself to stand her ground. I don't know what was promised. The shadows shifted. They laughed, not loud and not human. Thin, airy sounds, like wind through dead leaves. Then tell us how to break the debt. Eileen swallowed hard. Her hands trembled. The match burned slower. This was it. This was what Callahan had warned her. They were giving her a choice. Find the answer or be taken. She opened her mouth and nothing came out. Eileen's mind raced. Tell them how to break the debt. This was the only way out, but she didn't know. She had found the records, seen the name, her ancestor, but she didn't know what he had promised. She didn't know what they wanted. The Hollowfolk waited, tall and still, shadows shifting beneath them. The one closest to her lifted its hand again. Tell us. Eileen's breath came short and sharp. The match burned to her fingertips. She hissed and dropped it. The flame snuffed out. The dark rushed in. The Hollowfolk stepped closer. Tell us. Her pulse pounded. Her fingers dug into her coat. There had to be a way, some trick, some loophole, but when she opened her mouth, nothing came. The Hollowfolk laughed. It was not the sound of amusement. It was the sound of hunger. Then you are ours. The tallest one reached for her, its hand stretching too far and too long. Eileen staggered back. Wait! The shadows surged forward. The world tilted, and the dark swallowed her whole. Eileen fell into the darkness. It was not the darkness of night, not the darkness of closed eyes. It was thicker and it was heavier. A cold that sank beneath skin and into bone. She tried to scream, but the sound never left her lips. She was falling or sinking, or being pulled. The world around her stretched and bent, twisting in on itself like something alive. She saw glimpses, flashes of places that had never been. A forest with no sky, a river that ran black, figures standing just out of sight, and then a door. Not wood, not stone, something else. It stood open, and beyond it, shadows, laughter, hands reaching to welcome her home. Eileen tried to turn away, tried to claw her way back to the light, but the Hollowfolk had already claimed her, and there was no breaking the debt, not anymore. The door closed, and Eileen O'Shea was never seen again. Chapter 6. The Descent. The town searched for Eileen. They combed the woods, the mine, the river banks. They found nothing. Sheriff Turner led the search for 3 days before calling it off. Seamus O'Shea didn't speak, didn't cry. He just sat on the porch, staring into the trees. The townsfolk whispered. They said she had wandered too deep into the old tunnels, that the earth had swallowed her whole just like the others. But some, the old ones, the ones who still remembered the stories, they didn't search at all, because they knew. Eileen O'Shea hadn't vanished. She had been taken, and the Hollowfolk always kept what they claimed. It started with the wind. Nights grew colder, even as summer stretched long, and then came the whispers. Soft at first, just a breeze curling through the trees, through the cracks in the doors and the windows. Then a name. Eileen. The Bellamy boy heard it first. Then the McGowan twins. Then Margaret Bellamy herself, who one night woke to find her front door standing wide open. She swore she had locked it, swore she had bolted it shut, and from the tree line, just beyond the candlelight, she swore she saw a shape. Not quite shadow, not quite Eileen. Something else, something thin, something watching, and then laughter. A sound like leaves rustling, a sound like something waiting just beyond the trees. The first to see her was the widow. Callahan woke to the wind rustling her shutters, the air in her room sharp with the scent of damp earth. She knew before she even rose from bed. Before she stepped to the window, before she pulled the curtain aside, she knew what she would see. And yet, when she looked out into the trees, When she saw the figure standing there, thin and still, with a shadow that moved before it did, her breath still caught in her throat, not because she was afraid, but because she pitied her. Eileen O'Shea had been a strong girl, a smart girl, but it hadn't mattered. The hollow folk always got what they were owed, and now she was one of them. The shape in the woods, tilting its head. Not quite recognition, not quite anything. Callahan let the curtain fall. She whispered a prayer in the older language, a language older than English. Then she bolted the door. It would not keep her out, not if she truly wanted in. But if the hollow folk did not break things, they did not shatter glass or splinter wood, they only waited, they only watched. And when the time came, they whispered a name, and waited for someone to answer. It wasn't long before the children started seeing her. Not often, not clearly, just a glimpse, a shape between the trees, a shadow where there shouldn't be one. The Bellamy twins said they saw a woman standing at the riverbed, her feet just barely touching the water. She didn't speak. She just watched them. The McGowan boy, barely 6, woke his mother in the middle of the night crying about the lady at the window. She had no face, he said, but she had a voice, and she had whispered his name. His mother had shushed him, told him it was a bad dream. But in the morning, when she stepped outside, she saw footprints in the dirt beneath the window, bare, small, like a girl's. The wind picked up that day, and somewhere in the trees the laughter started again, soft and light, like a secret waiting to be told. One night, Margaret Bellamy woke to the sound of knocking, soft, gentle, not at the door, at the window. She sat up slowly, her breath caught in her throat. The cabin was dark. The embers in the hearth had long since dried. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then, tap, tap, tap. Her blood turned to ice. She turned her head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, the fabric barely shifting in the breeze, but the air felt different, like something was on the other side, waiting and watching. The knock came again, and this time, the voice was light, familiar. Margaret's stomach twisted. She knew that voice. She had heard it in town, at the market, on the church steps. Eileen. The room felt too small. She squeezed her hands into fists. Let me in. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut. It wasn't her. It wasn't her. The wind picked up, the shutters rattled, and then the knocking stopped. Margaret let out a slow, shaking breath. Then a new sound. The soft creak of a door. Not the window, the front door. Margaret's breath stopped. She had locked it. She was sure she had locked it. But when she turned her head, the door was open. Just a crack. Just enough for something to slip through. Margaret stared at it. The wind whispered against the walls, and from the dark behind the doorway, laughter. By morning, Margaret Bellamy was gone. The town searched just like they had for Jacob, just like they had for Eileen, and they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle. Just her front door, left slightly ajar, like someone had stepped outside, like someone had been called. The whispers started soon again after. She heard her name. She answered. She followed the hollow girl. The elders warned the children not to listen, to keep their doors bolted, the windows latched, to never answer a voice in the night. But it didn't matter, because by then the whole town knew the truth. Eileen O'Shea had not disappeared. She was still here, in the woods, in the wind. She was calling, and sooner or later, someone would be fool enough to answer. Chapter 7. The Hollow Curse. Seamus O'Shea knew his daughter was gone. He had known the moment she didn't come home. He hadn't joined the search party, hadn't asked for prayers at the church, because he knew. And the town knew too. People avoided his cabin now. They crossed the road when they saw him coming. He heard their whispers. She was marked. The debt had to be paid. He should have told her the truth. Seamus didn't care what they had said, because none of it changed anything. Eileen was gone, and the hollow folk still weren't done. It started with small things. The front door left open, even though he swore he locked it. The sound of footsteps on the porch late at night. A shadow moving at the edge of the tree line. And then, one night, a knock at the window. Seamus didn't turn, didn't move. But the knock came again, soft, patient, waiting, and then, Pa! Seamus clenched his jaw. The voice was hers. Pa, let me in. He didn't. He wouldn't. He'd spent his whole life knowing this would come, but that didn't make it easier. It's cold out here. Seamus squeezed his eyes shut. He gripped the arm of his chair, fingers digging into the wood. The wind howled, the fire burned low, and then the knocking stopped. Seamus exhaled, long and shaking. Before he could move, the door creaked open. Seamus didn't turn, didn't rise from his chair, didn't reach for the shotgun propped against the hearth, because he knew it wouldn't matter. The fire flickered low, casting the room in shifting shadows. The door stood open, not fully, just enough. A whisper of cold air slid inside, and with it, her. A shape moved beyond the threshold, a figure too thin. A step on the wooden floor, soft and barefoot. Pa. Seamus clenched his jaw. It wasn't her. It couldn't be her. She was gone. But the voice was so much like hers. A shadow stretched long across the floor, too long. Seamus gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white. You never told me, Pa. The voice was closer now. You never told me how to break it. The air in the room shrank, and then, look at me, Pa. He didn't. He wouldn't, because if he did, he knew she would smile, and it wouldn't be on her face. The fire crackled low. The room felt smaller. Seamus O'Shea didn't move. The floorboards creaked as the thing that wore his daughter's voice stepped closer. Look at me, Pa. Seamus kept his gaze fixed on the hearth, on the burning embers. You always told me not to be afraid of the dark. A soft laugh, thin and hollow. But you are, aren't you? Seamus clenched his jaw. A whisper of movement, closer. A chill brushed his skin, cold as the grave. He could feel it now, standing just beside his chair, close enough to touch. He could smell the earth on it, the damp rot of the mine. You let me go. His fingers dug into the wood. You knew, and you let me go. Seamus exhaled, slow and shaking. She wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. He had known what she would do and known what would happen. He had known the debt would come due, and he had done nothing. Look at me, Pa. The fire flickered. The shadow stretched. And then a hand rested on his shoulder. Not warm, not human. Cold as stone. Seamus O'Shea shut his eyes because if he looked, if he so much as glanced up, he knew he would never stop looking. The hand on Seamus's shoulder didn't move. Cold seeping through his shirt, spreading through his bones. He gritted his teeth. You knew, she whispered. The voice was so close now. And you knew I'd go. Seamus exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. He had always known this day would come. He had prepared for it. He had told himself over and over when it came, he would not break. He would not look. But his God help him, he wanted to. Pa, she murmured. His breath paused. The hand on the shoulder tightened, just slightly, just enough to remind him that she was still waiting. Seamus O'Shea shut his eyes and whispered, I'm sorry. Silence. Then something shifted. The pressure lifted from his shoulder. The air grew lighter. The thing wearing his daughter's voice sighed, not angry, not grieving, just tired. The wind outside stilled. Seamus opened his eyes. The door shut. The fire burning steady again. The room was empty. Seamus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But he didn't move. Didn't rise from his chair. Because he knew this wasn't over. Not for him, not for the town. As the hollow folk still waited. And his daughter's voice would call again. Seamus didn't sleep that night. Didn't move from his chair. Didn't unbolt the door. By morning the air had shifted. The town felt different. People still whispered about Margaret Bellamy's disappearance, and how the Bellamy twins were kept inside almost all day now by Clara. And yet no one spoke of Eileen anymore. Not out loud, not by name. But Seamus still heard her. When he walked through town, when he passed through the old church, when he stood alone by the tree line, the wind still carried her voice. Soft, distant, A thread of sound unraveling in the trees. The whispers weren't for him anymore. Not yet, because she had others to call. He saw it in their faces, the way the children stared too long at the woods, the way the elders refused to step outside after dark. The hollow folk had taken her, and now she was one of them. She was waiting, watching, calling. And sooner or later, people would answer. Chapter 8. The Hollow Girl. It was one of the Bellamy twins who heard her first. Late one night, long after his sister had bolted the doors and drawn the curtains, he lay awake in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind press against the walls. Then, a voice, soft, gentle. Hello. His voice caught. It came from outside the window. He turned his head slowly. The curtains were drawn, the fabric swaying just slightly, as if someone had brushed against it. His heart pounded. He knew the stories, knew what happened to his mother and what his sister had told him. If you hear a voice at night, do not answer. But it sounded so kind, so familiar. Not like the monsters in the stories. Not like something that wanted to take him. Another whisper, closer this time. It's all right. You don't have to be afraid. The boy swallowed hard. He reached for the edge of the curtain. His fingers hesitated. Then slowly, he pulled back. The glass was fogged with breath, and beyond it a figure, standing just at the tree line, tall and thin. Her hair stirred in the wind, her feet bare against the frost. She lifted a hand. She waved. And then she smiled. Not on her face, but in her shadow. The boy's breath froze in his chest. His fingers let go of the curtain, and the last thing he heard before he shut his eyes tight, before he pulled the blankets over his head, was laughter. The next morning, the Bellamy boy said nothing. He didn't tell his sister or his brother about the whispering. Didn't tell her about the girl in the trees, because he knew what she would say. You were dreaming it. You imagined it. Don't speak of it. But he had seen her. Eileen. Not the way she had been in town, laughing with Clara, arguing with her father. Not human. Not anymore. His hands trembled as he sat at the breakfast table. Despite not saying it, Clara noticed. What's wrong? The boy shook his head quickly. Nothing. Clara Bellamy studied him for a long moment. Then she placed a gentle hand on his. Did you hear something last night? He tensed. He could lie. He could say no. Say he had slept fine. But when he looked up at his sister, he knew she already knew. So instead he whispered, She said my name. That night, Clara Bellamy didn't sleep. She sat in the old rocking chair by the fire, blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her fingers curled tight around a rosary. She wasn't praying. She didn't know if that would help. She was only listening. The wind pressed against the walls, the shutters rattled, and somewhere in the trees, a voice came. Soft, familiar. Come outside. Clara's throat tightened. She clenched the rosary harder. Just for a moment. The voice was so close, like it was whispering just beyond the door. Clara's breath came short, slowly, carefully. She turned her head towards the front door. It was locked, bolted. She had checked it, twice. But the whispering didn't stop. You don't have to be afraid. Clara shut her eyes. She wouldn't answer. She wouldn't listen. The fire flickered. The wind sighed. And then, the soft creak of a door opening. Clara's breath caught. She snapped her eyes open. The front door stood wide. The cold night air pressed against her skin. The wind howled through the opening, and in the darkness beyond the threshold, a figure stood waiting. Clara Bellamy couldn't breathe. The front door stood wide open. Beyond it, the night waited. And in the dark, just past the porch steps, someone stood there, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. Clara gripped the arms of her chair. Her pulse pounded against the inside of her ribs. She knew what she should do. She should get up. She should shut the door, bolt it, lock it. But she couldn't move. Because the longer she stared into the dark, the longer she looked at that long, thin figure standing just beyond the light, the more its head tilted, a slow and almost curious motion like it was listening, the more frozen she felt. And then it took a step forward. Clara flinched, but it didn't reach for her. It just stood there, close enough now that she could see the way its feet barely touched the ground, close enough that she could see the hollow pits where its eyes should be, and then it smiled. Not on its face, in its shadow. Clara inhaled sharply. She lurched to her feet, grabbed the door, and slammed it shut. Her hands fumbled for the bolt, forcing it into place. The wind pressed against the cabin's walls, and the fire crackled low into the hearth, and then from the other side of the door, footsteps, slow, dragging, moving away. Clara pressed her forehead against the wood. Her breath came fast, shallow. She didn't turn, didn't check the window. She didn't need to. She already knew. Eileen O'Shea was still out there, and she was still waiting. Chapter 9. The Name That Answers. The Bellamy boy woke to silence. The cabin was dark, the fire long dead. For a moment he lay still, his breath slow and steady. Then a whisper. "Come here, little one." His chest tightened. The wind had stopped. The trees had gone still, but the voice remained, soft, gentle, calling. He turned his head towards the window. The curtains moved, not from the wind, but from breath on the glass. The boy swallowed. He knew the stories, knew not to listen, but the voice was so kind. "I'm so lonely." His fingers trembled beneath the blanket. His heart pounded. The whisper curled against the glass. "Won't you come outside?" The boy stared at the window, at the thin, dark shape just beyond it. She smiled, not on her face, but in the shadow beneath her, and then she waved. The Bellamy boy didn't move, didn't breathe. The girl at the window tilted her head, waiting, watching. "You don't have to be afraid." The whisper curled through the glass, soft as a lullaby. The boy squeezed his eyes shut. "Don't listen. That's what his mother would say if you were still here. Don't listen. Don't answer. Don't step outside. Just open the door." The boy clenched the blankets tighter around himself. The room felt smaller. The air felt colder. The whisper came again. "Please." Thin, gentle, almost sad. He peeked from beneath the blanket. The shape at the window had not moved, but its shadow had, stretching longer, closer. The boy shut his eyes again. He didn't speak, didn't answer, didn't move. And after a long moment, the whispering stopped. The cold lifted. The room felt like itself again. Slowly, so slowly, the boy opened his eyes. The window was empty. The trees stood still. The girl in the dark was gone. But she would come back, because the hollow girl had all the time in the world, and she could wait forever. The Bellamy boy didn't tell his sister what he had seen, or his twin. Didn't tell them about the whispering, or the breath on the glass, or the girl who stood too still, because he knew what they would say. Don't speak of it. Don't give it power. Forget it, and pray that it forgets you. However, we know the hollow folk never forget. And while the town had tried to forget Eileen O'Shea, while it had buried her name in whispers and warnings, had closed their doors, bolted their windows, turned away from the trees, she was still there, still calling, still waiting for someone to answer. And deep down, everyone knew it, because they always did. Autumn came. Trees burned red and gold. The air was crisp with bite of early frost, and the town carried on. Men went to the mines, women hung laundry in the thin morning sun. Children played in the schoolyard, their laughter too loud, as if trying to drown out the silence beneath it. But no one went near the woods. Not anymore. Not after the Bellamy boy woke screaming one night, swearing he heard his name in the wind. Not after Margaret was lost. Eileen was lost. and Jacob was lost. Not after Widow McCallahan told them of what she had seen out her own window. After she had woken whispering something in Gaelic, something no one dared ask her to translate before, locking her door and never answering it again. They all knew. The Hollow folk still watched. The Hollow girl still waited. But for now, the town was quiet. For now, the doors remained closed. For now, no one had answered. But the Hollow folk always wait. And sooner or later, someone always answers.